The magic of prophecy. The prologue. Fear and fire. A thin mist crept out of the dark woodlands and slowly into the valley they surrounded, its white vapour devouring and diluting the light of the morning sun. With it came a cold, damp breeze that made it already oppressive atmosphere of the village almost unbearable to its inhabitants. It was a small, ramshackle affair consisting of some 20 crudely built huts of mud and straw, with a centre square and a single meandering mud track that served as a road. Normally it would be filled with the inhabitants and their animals, yet today the village was empty and almost deathly quiet. All activity was occurring in just two areas outside the settlement, each on almost opposite ends. At one end, women and children could be seen moving rapidly into the trees, carrying whatever meagre belongings they could bear, hoping that they could escape them. On the other side, the men were making their own preparations for their arrival. The villagers had known for months that they were coming closer, yet all had believed that they would be overlooked. They were a small community and were no threat to anyone or anything, yet they had been wrong. The smaller village of Grelk had been cleansed only yesterday, and only one of the scouts they had sent out to investigate had returned. The news he had brought had not been good. The entire population had been destroyed, their village burnt to the ground. Their next step was almost certainly here, and the villagers knew they had waited too long. This knowledge had not prevented them from trying to do something, for they all held out hope that this last desperate gamble would pay off. The men were to remain and hold them off, whilst the women and children fled to the woods. It was a near hopeless gamble. The hastily erected earthen barricades would prove no obstacle to the monstrous beasts they rode, even with the wooden stakes set into its damp soil. The crude clubs and farm implements would never penetrate their armoured shells, and the villagers wore nothing that would shield them from their hideous weapons. Yet the defenders clung defiantly onto the one hope in their hearts, that they would buy time for their families to escape. It was the one hope that prevented most of them from running when they suddenly emerged from the woods ahead. They were truly an awesome sight. Row upon row of towering warriors, riding monstrous beasts from which smoke seemed to curl from their mouths. As they moved closer, the weak sunlight glittered off their metallic shells, making it seem as if they were surrounded by an aura of light and energy. The light flickered almost menacingly, as if alive, and seemed to reach out to the defenders, to grab or hold them. More than one villager went pale and fled at the sight as the light seemed to strike at their very souls, and many more felt the blood drain from their faces as a sickening fear grabbed them. Suddenly they stopped. The defenders felt a momentary surge of hope before realizing that this was merely the calm before the storm. The horde parted, and from their midst rode a single warrior to face them. As its beast came to a halt, the massive warrior slowly raised its weapon high into the morning light. It was by far the most fearsome sight that the villagers had ever seen. It was encased in a glittering silver shell, and it towered above all others. Power radiated almost visibly around it, and its fearsome visage seemed to almost snarl at them. The black beast it rode stared malevolently down at them, and none of the villagers could stare back for more than a few seconds. Vapour poured from its mouth in slow waves, and for the villagers it was as if time itself had slowed down. The silence of their foe was total and unnatural. The breeze died, as if the weather itself held its breath. And fear began to drain the villagers of the last vestige of their resolve. Yet one stood tall. He raised one of the few hunting bows in the village, aimed it, and loosed an arrow. It flew straight and true, yet it seemed to slow its flight almost to a crawl before vanishing as if it had never been. That one act destroyed the last vestige of hope in many of the villagers. Some turned and fled, others broke down in choking sobs, knowing that death herself was here. It was at that moment that the lead warrior moved. The weapon was lowered, and behind it the horde moved as one towards the barricade. Yet still not a single sound could be heard. Even the beast's thunderous gallop was mute. The wall of silence proved too much for the rest of the villagers, who turned and fled, their screams swallowed up by the approaching silence. Suddenly, the wooden spears on the barricade exploded into tiny fragments, showering the few remaining defenders with thousands of needle-sharp splinters, and as the warriors reached the barricade's remains, sound returned to the world once more. The warriors roared out a battle cry, and the pounding of the beast's shod hooves mingled in to create a terrible cacophony that caused the remaining doomed defenders to turn and flee. In no way could their 2 legs carry them faster than the 4 legs of the warriors' beasts, and their screams were added to the horrifying sounds of the erupting conflict. Their cries lasted but a few minutes, for that was all the time needed for the massacre to be completed. It did not end there, however. The warriors swept onwards through the village towards the fleeing families. Even with their head start, they had no hope of fleeing the warriors' beasts. Yet more screams filled the air as the women and children were cut down from behind or trampled beneath the stampeding beasts. In one part of the village, a warrior came across 2 children huddling together fearfully. With barely a repressed shudder, the warrior cut them down before continuing the chase. The battle was over in minutes, and soon a new silence rose up. The commanding warrior rode slowly into the village. It reached for its head to remove its helm and survey the scene. The knight nodded his head in satisfaction. It had been a good, clean fight. He had lost no troops and met with little resistance. Yet, like all battles, the weariness of battle magic would soon be upon him, and he still had much to do. At that moment, a junior officer rode up to him. "We believe that some may have escaped into the woods. Shall we organise a search for them, my lord?" she asked calmly. "Yes," he replied, "but be quick about it, as there are many villagers in need of purification today." She bowed in obedience, turned her horse back to a reserve contingent, always on hand for such occasions, and rode off. As he watched her go, he noted the ambitious look in her eyes. He knew that she would become a great knight one day. He shook his head in weariness. He was too long in the saddle for this, but he did not have much longer to go. A few more battles and he could retire home to his family for a while, though that could not be his concern today. Villagers were waiting to be cleansed, though nothing could be done until this village had been dealt with completely. Knowing that the chase would not take very long, he took a brief glance around. He noticed the severed head of a villager lying in the filthy mud at the centre of the square. He decided to take one last look at his most hated of enemies. He carefully lifted the head with the tip of his sword and examined it slowly. It had probably been male, but it was so caked with mud and filth that identification was difficult. It had dark, matted hair that seemed almost alive with lice. Its skin was heavily tanned and weathered, making it seem dirtier. It had small grey eyes, a large flat nose and swollen lips. The smell was nauseating. He shuddered with revulsion and felt like an old fool. He flicked the sword out violently and sent the goblin's head spinning through the air. It struck a nearby hut with a sickening crack and fell to the ground. He looked away from the crushed head in disgust. He had purified some 50 villagers in this war, and he had still found them completely hideous to look at. He turned his thoughts to other things. Tomorrow, his tour of Grouchin would be over, and in a month he would be back home, if only briefly, and spending time with his wife and daughter again. A moment later, the junior officer returned, breaking off that pleasant train of thought. "It is done, my lord. They have all perished under the fist of Torek," said the young woman with an almost exultant look in her face. "Very well, then," he replied, returning his thoughts back to the task at hand. "Let flame purify this village." "By the will of Torek," she said, bowing her head swiftly. "By the will of Torek," he replied wearily. Fortunately, she had been too flushed with success to notice his apparent lack of enthusiasm. As he watched her ride away again, he sighed in resignation. He had spoken the ritual command many times, and he still could not see why it should be used. It seemed a little unnecessary to him. He moved his thoughts quickly to other matters. Thoughts like that could earn him another visit to the chambers. He shook his head again, angry with himself for losing control like that. If the Covenant caught it, he did not allow that thought to continue, resolving to spend this night in prayer to Torek. He replaced his helm and rode out of the village. He never once looked back. entrusting the remainder of the purification to be handled by the junior officer. The command to burn the village broke the relative silence of the settlement. Knights with flaming brands rode through the village, setting fire to everything they passed by. The straw and wood, though damp, quickly caught fire with a little magical aid, and soon the whole village was in flames. Screams rose from a nearby haystack where a goblin woman had hidden herself with her baby, hoping to escape the knight's wrath. The knights rode past, ignoring the screams completely, and formed ranks behind their commander. They rode out of the village and on towards the next in their path. The screams soon died out, as did the flames. When the mist finally lifted, all that remained was the black and charred pieces of what had once been a bustling village. The air remained still, and all was quiet, the lively chatter of the villagers silenced forever.